Greetings and welcome to this presentation on the topic of Christians in government. In addressing the subject of Christians in government, there are numerous topics under that heading that could be covered. I've chosen to address two. Part 1 will be on biblical economics. Which economic system for a nation is the most biblical? Socialism, capitalism, or some other? Part 2 will be about religious values versus contemporary demands and government rulings. For Part 1, Biblical Economics, we will compare capitalism and socialism. Which is more biblical? And which is more successful? There are several kinds of economic systems in the world, but I will address primarily these two which are the most prominent. We will look at the economic system set forth in the Old Testament, examples from the New Testament like Acts 2 and 4, which has raised a lot of questions as to whether this was socialism. And in societal economics, what is our responsibility? What is the government's responsibility? My time layout will be 4 sessions, about 20 minutes each, to address all these topics in Part 1. Then another 4 to 5 sessions, about 20 minutes each, to address the religious values versus contemporary demands and government rulings in Part 2. Before we begin Part 1, I need to let you know that I'm not an economist, a lawyer, nor a constitutional scholar. Rather, I have simply studied the Bible, kept myself informed on the current political climate, and come up with these insights and observations from the Bible, which has basic foundational principles that speak to every area of life. And since my presentation addresses government, which involves politics, you will probably be naturally scrutinizing me as to whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican or a Libertarian. But I hope that you'll not so much scrutinize me as to whether I'm a Democrat or Republican or Libertarian, but rather, am I biblical? With that, let's begin. I have quite a number of Bible passages to lay the foundation for our topic, so bear with me for a few minutes. And I should point out that all or most of these quotations are from the New International Version. Now, in the books of the law, Exodus through Deuteronomy, we see that God set forth much of that law as precepts for the ordering of a nation. In Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 and 6, Moses said this, "See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.'" And then, in chapter 28, verse 1, "If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all His commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on the earth." One of those commands is in Deuteronomy 8, which contains a nugget of truth and a key principle about economics that we will examine more in depth later. He precedes this passage by telling the nation of Israel that when they eat and are satisfied and become wealthy, be careful not to become proud and forget the Lord, what He has done for them. Because then Moses goes on to say in verse 17 and 18, "You may say to yourself, 'My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me.' But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your ancestors as it is today." Here's another one from Deuteronomy 15. "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites, and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work, and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Here's one about land as property and the poor. Leviticus 25, 24 to 28 and verse 35. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value of the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property. But if they do not acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee, and I'll have more to say about that later. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property. If any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. In this next passage, we start to get into God's instruction for government in Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settle in it, and you say, "Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us," be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Later, we will return and look at these key points of these Bible passages, but now that we have gained a quick view of a biblical foundation for the economics of a nation, let's now get a view of economic systems that exist in our world by looking at some definitions. Here is the definition of socialism. Any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or government ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. This comes from Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, and I've emphasized certain key words there. Here is the definition of capitalism. The economic system in which all or most of the means of production and distribution, as land, factories, railroads, etc., are privately owned and operated for profit, originally under fully competitive conditions. Here is the definition of free enterprise, which is essentially the same as capitalism, just a little variation in the definition. The economic doctrine or practice of permitting private industry to operate under freely competitive conditions with a minimum of governmental control. Now, is the biblical system from the passages we read earlier, is the biblical system more like socialism or free enterprise, capitalism? Just think about that a moment. I don't expect you to come up with an answer just yet, because we're just getting a quick view introduction at this point. In order to help with the understanding of these economic systems, let's look at some illustrations. These illustrations have been around for many years, and you can find them on the internet simply by typing in the words, "You have 2 cows." They're rather amusing and give the picture quite well. So here we go. An illustration of socialism. You have 2 cows. The government takes one of them and gives it to your neighbor. Here's an illustration of communism, which is a more extreme form of socialism. You have 2 cows. The government takes both of them and gives you part of the milk. In capitalism or free enterprise, you have 2 cows. You sell one and buy a bull. And from there you get the idea. The 2 have calves and you increase your herd of cattle. Here's a video illustration that I found on the internet. You can see that the video added fascism too, which is helpful to know. So now that we have a better idea of these systems, let's ask the question again. Is the biblical system more like socialism, communism, and we could add fascism in there too, or free enterprise capitalism? I say free enterprise or capitalism because the key difference we see between the systems is that in socialism and communism, the government is in charge. In capitalism or free enterprise, you are in charge. We see this in the Bible passages that we read. God gives the instructions and puts the individual person in charge. And recall that it says, "It is the Lord your God who gives you the ability to produce wealth." Nothing in there about government intervention or interference. And in fact, in the last Bible passage we read, we see that God puts clear limitations on the governing ruler, the king. So, in capitalism, free enterprise, you have 2 cows, you sell one and buy a bull. Adding to that a bit, here's what I call Judeo-Christian capitalism. You have 2 cows, you sell one, buy a bull, and give some of the offspring and milk to your needy neighbors, much like the depiction we saw in the video. Here's another illustration from Winston Churchill, comparing the 3 systems. Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain in the 1940s and 50s, and well known for his profound and witty sayings. Here's what he said: "Capitalism is the unequal distribution of wealth. Socialism is the equal distribution of poverty. Communism is socialism with a gun at your back." Which system is more biblical according to that? Now, the United States of America did not become the great and prosperous nation that it is because of socialism or communism. The U.S. economy is a free market capitalism system for the most part, not 100%, but for the most part. In fact, socialism was tried and failed in the early American farming economies by the first settlers in 1607 and the Pilgrims in 1620. The charter for the first settlers and the merchants who underwrote the colony for the Pilgrims required everyone to raise crops on ground which they all had joint ownership of, and stores in which they had joint ownership. Some worked more, and some were lazy and worked less. But the rule was that everyone had equal access to all the goods. So those who worked hard had little hope of personal gain. This policy led to stagnation. But when all worked their own plot of ground, this put pressure on the lazy ones to get with it and work to their full potential and ability. As a result, the community prospered. The United States did not become prosperous because of socialist practices and government handouts, but industrious people and individual responsibility. History also shows the failure of socialism and communism in other countries. For example, the former communist Soviet Union, presently communist North Korea. When you look at a satellite view of North and South Korea, the contrast is evident. North Korea has a lot of darkness, but South Korea has numerous lights, clearly showing the industriousness and wealth of productivity in that nation. Communist China has had to turn to free enterprise markets on the local level, and these areas are becoming prosperous. The former communist East Germany was desperate to get into the prosperous free market system of West Germany. The divided country was separated by the Berlin Wall. But there was that historic moment when the East Germans broke down the Berlin Wall in their quest for freedom. It was hard on the West Germans for a while until they could accommodate and get their East German neighbors situated. But the formerly two Germanys are now one country. Then there's communist Cuba. Refugee boats fleeing Cuba to get into the U.S. No refugee boats fleeing the U.S. to get to Cuba. Nowadays, there's the pitiful situation in Venezuela, which has recently gone socialistic. Poverty is rampant. Food and other goods are hard to get. People wait in long lines just to get food. So, socialism doesn't work. It only leads to poverty. Now, many will say, but there's one nation where it does work, Sweden. No. A man named Nima Sanandaji, who was raised in Sweden, has written a book called Debunking Utopia, Exposing the Myth of Nordic Socialism. In this book, he not only studies Sweden, but other countries as well. He points out that Sweden's prosperity did not come from socialism, but from a free enterprise economy before they turned to socialistic practices and after they turned away from socialistic policies. They stagnated under socialist policies. Furthermore, its unique elements of their culture make them a successful nation. A strong work ethic and emphasis on individual responsibility, not high taxes and big government. These are just a few of the points that he makes, and there's much more to it as he points out in his book. He also points out that income equality among citizens is a highly desired feature in any nation, and the country that has the greatest degree of income equality is not Sweden, but Slovenia, interestingly. When we look at the world as a whole, history shows that over many years, free enterprise has elevated everyone to a better standard of living than what existed before. So even those classified at the poverty level are better off than they were several decades ago. Dennis Prager, a radio talk show host, stated back in December 19th of 2017, quote, "Socialism only spends the money that capitalism creates." And Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of Britain back in the 1980s, said, "The trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money." And that concludes this segment See you next time for the second segment on biblical economics.